Hello, welcome back. I'm Dr. Mark, and today we're going to review the neurological changes that happen in a brain of a patient that has suicidal ideation. This is the same talk I gave last year in the Mexican Congress on Neurology and Psychiatry, so I hope you enjoy it. So, for us to understand the relationship between brain, its changes, and suicide ideation, and attempts, we need only to look to one of the greatest minds in the field of arts, who said, "I've got nature, art, and poetry. If that isn't enough, what is?" As Vincent van Gogh. This famous Dutch painter that is responsible for some of the greatest works of art that humanity has known. So we might be tempted to ask, what is happiness? And what leads, of course, to happiness. Van Gogh had, throughout his life, over 2,100 paintings. Most of them were made during his last 2 years of life, as he was approaching the moment when he took his own life. Even though he didn't have much recognition when he was alive, he started to be known, so he was already recognized by some other painters that knew about his work and about his important steps towards Impressionism, of course, a trend that was very popular after his death. He was very close with his brother Theo all of his life. They were really intimate, and his brother Theo helped him through all of the rough patches he had in his life. However, he always showed signs of depression, even as a child. Everyone who knew him said that he was always sad, he was always with these dark thoughts that haunted him. And he finally shot himself in the chest on July 27th, 1890, when he was only 37 years old. So even by the standards of the 19th century, he still had a lot of years of work, of production, and of course, enjoying his own life. Now, how important is suicide in our current modern world? There are over 700,000 deaths per year associated with suicide attempts and suicidal ideation. Basically, one person every 14 seconds takes its own life. Even in the patients that don't manage to take their own life successfully, it's associated with permanent lesions and disability. Even Van Gogh had the loss of an ear, not in a suicide attempt, but of course as a self-mutilation throughout his life. It's more common in young people, so it's a very important cause of death and disability and of course lesions in younger patients. And 77% of these deaths and lesions, accidents, and so on and so forth, occur in countries with median and low income levels. The greatest tragedy, of course, of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, and of course patients that manage to take their own life, in most cases the patient shows signs of wanting to harm him or herself way before the attempt comes to fruition. So the healthcare professionals and the family members, they can help those patients and support them, and even bring them to the remission of depression or of the suicidal ideation. But in some cases, we act just too late. So with all of this, one might ask, well, what's wrong with these brains, with the patients that are suffering so much that they are thinking about taking their own lives? And just as any other mental health issue, we have three main pillars or three core issues that we may find. Some patients may have the three of them altered, some may only have one, but very severely. We have, of course, the spectrum or the sphere of the biological, the neurotransmitters, the anatomy of the brain, how the neuron cells or the nerve cells are functioning in those patients. Of course, there is alterations there in this group of patients. Then we have the mind, what is traditionally known as the mind. Here we could include things like the personality of that patient, the thoughts he's having, if he's a pessimism, optimism, all these immaterial things that we cannot measure, but that the patient expresses through their personality, their speech, and everything else. And of course, equally important, we have the environment. Patient's environment, if it's nourishing, if it's toxic, if it's highly hostile against the patient, of course it can alter the other two. This is very important. Every one of these pillars can alter the other. So if we have a very severe
brain issue, a very important organic disease. Of course, this causes alterations of the mind and the environment. A very toxic environment can change our thoughts and the chemistry of our brain. So these are all interconnected. So if all of these are interconnected, the main theory for how suicidal ideation appears is the stress diathesis theory. This basically says that these patients have a predisposition. The predisposition is also known as diathesis. So diathesis means they already had something in one of these spheres or all of these spheres that lead that brain to not being able to manage some types of pain, and thus the patient prefers to take their own life. So in this diathesis, so the predisposition, once again, we can find factors in each of these pillars. In the environment, the most important diathesis factor, the most important predisposing factor for suicidal ideation is, of course, early childhood trauma. This early childhood trauma can include things like being attacked, sexually attacked or physically attacked, bullying, of course, other types of abuses, substance abuse, all these things. The earlier these things happen, of course, they have a greater impact on the brain, on the thoughts of that patient, on the mind, and it creates a larger predisposition for that patient. If we hop to the mind, to this immaterial thing that the patient expresses, of course, here we mainly find personality traits, things the patient has really embedded in his thinking process. Here, the main ones are impulsivity and inhibition. That's probably one of the most important, along with aggressivity. These two, of course, are the two main risk factors, speaking once again about personality and mind, for a patient that later on will have suicidal ideation. We may also find things like pessimism and, of course, other mental health issues like depression. And this is very important because sometimes people think that suicide and suicidal ideation is just like a super depression. A very, very depressed patient is the one that is going to commit suicide. This is not false. Of course, a very depressed patient is in a very high risk factor or very high risk category for suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. However, we have other patients that are not depressed that might have suicidal attempts. And we have the typical story of a patient that receives a very bad diagnosis, for example, a terminally ill cancer, a very advanced cancer, and the patient, when receiving that diagnosis, takes his or her own life. That was not a depressed patient, that was a perfectly normal patient, but the shock of the cancer diagnosis was enough to, of course, defeat all of his mental barriers, all of his mental protections, and that's a patient that, of course, may try to commit suicide. We also have some risk factors that are more biological, so changes in genes. Of course, we find here genes associated with the main neurotransmitters. Here we find serotonin, noradrenaline, and of course the immune system inside of the brain. So a highly inflammatory immune response within the brain is also a very strong risk factor for suicidal ideation later on in the patient's lives. Anatomical changes, we're going to speak about them in a bit, but basically the amygdala, the center for fear, is not as responsive, it's smaller, so the patient is, of course, has more aggressivity, more impulsivity, has less inhibition of the cortex to these more quote-unquote primitive areas that are in charge of our emotions. And of course, we also find alterations in our neurotransmitter function. For example, low levels of serotonin may lead to depression, but not necessarily to suicidal ideation. However, higher levels of serotonin with alterations in the receptors for serotonin, so serotonin is higher, but the nerve cells respond less to serotonin, might be a stronger predictor of suicidal ideation than just low levels of serotonin. And this is also very interesting because we can find a similar phenomenon even in patients who are depressed. That maybe a very, very depressed patient talks about taking his or her own life, but doesn't do it. When we start the antidepressants and the patient feels a little better, a little more energetic, that's the moment the patient has a suicidal attempt. So increasing serotonin might even facilitate the path for suicidal attempts. Now, this diathesis doesn't necessarily come from birth. Some biological factors like genes, of course, are going to come from birth. Some personality traits might also come very early from the patient's lives, even sometimes from birth. However, early childhood trauma, of course, does not come from birth. And we can really see the way a patient's life can impact the development of their brain and, of course, some of the diseases we might find. Early childhood trauma, once again defined as a patient that has very severe traumatic experiences during early childhood. This can include some type of aggression, some type of attack, bullying, some type of very severe disease, intoxication. However, we might also find not so terrible things here, like a very bad divorce, like a very bad relationship with some of the family members. However, when there is a lot of stress in that child's life, or it's a very chronic stress, so it's a stress that doesn't go away, that lasts from months to years, this leads to changes in the brain of the patient. This is, of course, not the brain of a human being. This is the brain of a rat, and it's here because most of these studies have been made in mice and in rats. These findings have been replicated in human beings, and essentially what we find is that chronic stress, this early childhood trauma, can cause changes in basically all of the systems within our brain. We can find in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is, of course, one of the main centers for memory, and most of the trauma will, at least in part, be stored in that hippocampus. And these patients have an hippocampal dysfunction that leads to higher rates of depression and anxiety, learning deficit, so it's not learning as it should, this same hippocampus, fear generalization, so things that should cause a little fear now cause a lot of fear in those patients, and even the transfer of fear from one thing to transfer of fear to another thing. This would be like a phobia, being like arachnophobia, the very severe fear of spiders, that later on causes a very severe fear of the night in general, or of closed spaces, or something like that. And we also find less serotonin activity. 5-HT is 5-hydroxytryptamine. This is another name for serotonin. We also find alteration in the Raphael nuclei. These, of course, are the nuclei that produce serotonin, the main site for serotonin synthesis in the body. And we also find that the alterations in the Raphael nuclei because of early childhood trauma can lead to depression and anxiety, less serotonin signaling, and of course less serotonin activity. We might find a blunt stress response in the hormonal axis that is supposed to answer to our stress response. The amygdala, one of the main sites in the brain that perceives and generates the sensation of fear, is hyperactive, so the patient feels a lot more fear, a lot more depression and anxiety once again, and there is less communication with the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is one of the more advanced areas of the brain. Usually what happens is when we get stressed, the amygdala is the first one to turn on and cause the stress signal. And then the prefrontal cortex has to shut it down, to say, okay, I now know we're being attacked, we should be stressed, calm down, we will do something to manage this attack. However, here we have an amygdala that turns on too fast and too hard, and there is not enough communication with the prefrontal cortex to ensure that the amygdala later on turns off. So we have a patient that is very, very stressed a lot of the time. This lack of communication with the prefrontal cortex also causes impulsivity, as we were previously mentioning, and aggressivity. So the prefrontal cortex should keep in line all of the quote-unquote primitive nuclei of the brain. If we don't have that communication, those primitive nuclei get out of control, and of course we have a patient with less planning, less cognition problems, less extinction of fear, more depression and anxiety, and once again less activity of serotonin. All of these changes, they are not exclusive to suicidal ideation, so we might find some of them in other mental health conditions. However, these are the ones that have more profoundly, more directly been related to suicidal ideation. And of course, this is a review from 2022. If you are watching this video in the future, maybe we have even discovered new mechanisms that correlate with suicidal ideation. However, when we have all of these alterations, this once again is something that the young adult, the teen, is going to have from the childhood. So these alterations in the brain function is something that the patient is carrying, that it may be causing already a mental health condition, but it could also be a healthy patient, relatively healthy patient, apparently healthy patient, but that is now considering to take his or her own life. So that diathesis that the patient had, so the things that the patient was already carrying, is going now up against stress in this patient's life. Of course, heavy stress or severe stress is going to be a much more important factor, but if there is enough predisposition, even small amounts or smaller amounts of stress can lead to suicidal ideation. So we'll have that this patient comes up with a new traumatic event. This traumatic event is of course going to enter the brain through all of the senses, all of the patient's thoughts, through the thalamus. The thalamus will turn on the amygdala, as we were previously saying, and the amygdala is going to elicit a very strong fear and anger response. A lot of pain, of course, is going to appear. This turns on a series of nuclei to elicit that stress response, like the locus coeruleus and the raphe. These on top, locus coeruleus, are in charge of producing noradrenaline, and this on the bottom, the raphe nuclei, are the responsible for producing serotonin. We are going to have also a response from the hippocampus to remember, to memorize, to, of course, the next time avoid this traumatic event, but this is of course the source of much of the trauma that we'll carry the rest of our lives, that the hippocampus remembers that event and generates once again, even if the traumatic event does not reappear, just the hippocampus remembering the traumatic event will elicit the same stress response. The amygdala is also going to turn on this stress axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and it will in turn lead to the activation and high blood concentrations of cortisol. And with all of this, we have the complete stress response. In a normal patient, this traumatic event would lead to a severe stress, but later on, these same mechanisms that lead and cause stress would turn on or elicit an anti-stress response, and this is of course led by the brain cortex. And in the brain cortex we mainly find the prefrontal cortex, orbitotemporal cortex, and cingulate cortex. The cingulate cortex is very important because this is one of the main sites where we process painful processes. That's where we suffer basically. So these three nuclei will in turn have to turn off all of the stress response and say, okay, we now know that we're being attacked, that we're going through a traumatic event. Let's all calm down and let's get out of it. Let's survive and let's continue. However, as we were previously saying, there is not such a good communication between these and these other nuclei. Thus, the stress response is out of control. Going back to Van Gogh, he said, even though I'm frequently in the depths of misery, there's still calm, pure harmony and music within me. And this is of course echoed by the patients with suicidal ideation. They are very depressed, they are considering taking their own lives, they are suffering a lot, but with the proper treatment, with proper guidance, these patients can of course get out of that condition, get out of that very, very dark hole and recover the music, the harmony and the light in their lives. So what goes wrong in these patients? We already have mentioned it, but there is a lack of amygdala and cingulate cortex inhibition by prefrontal cortex. So these two structures run wild and they cause a lot of stress and a lot of suffering. We have an altered CRH cortisol response. This is the HPA axis that we were talking about, the hormones that physically produce stress. We have a hyperactive amygdala and cingulate cortex, more intense brain inflammatory response, and this is important because brain stress leads to inflammation. In most patients, this is self-limited. So when we are now relaxed, inflammation disappears. But in these patients, inflammation persists. And this also leads to, once again, this vicious circle where the amygdala and the cingulate cortex are even more hyperactive. With all of this, the basic result is that patients with suicidal ideation in general have more severe emotional pain, and they have a lessened capacity to handle that emotional pain. And suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts are, at least in part, a response to that emotional pain, seeking that emotional pain to decrease or, of course, to disappear. Now, this was, of course, a very superficial look into a very complex topic that is still being studied, but I hope it leads to you getting more interested in this topic, in these patients, and of course, that it may lead to a world where more research is done, more empathy is directed to these patients, and we all try to help them. However, this has important implications for current phenomena that are sometimes forgotten or poorly understood. For example, the relationship between antidepressants and suicide attempts. That in the first weeks of treatment with antidepressants, suicide attempts might increase, not decrease. And the patient might even feel a little better, and family members might be more relaxed, but that's specifically the most dangerous time for patients with suicidal ideation. And of course, also in such a brief review of this topic, I couldn't get into new therapies that are badly needed, that might change the way we treat these patients and the outcomes we expect from patients with suicidal ideation. And we here find things like esketamine, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, other things like psilocybin, and other new treatments. Finally, we close with some words from the master himself. Sadness will last forever, said Van Gogh. And as sadness will last forever, also our commitment with these patients to develop new treatments, to be with them, to show them kindness and empathy should also last forever.
Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Of course, our aim is to prevent these types of neurological severe diseases and protect the lives of our patients. So let's protect them. Thank you very much for watching. And as always, help us change the world. Share the information.